The Blue Jewel.
Chapter 5. Part 6. Arian knew that the credit was not his. The miraculous recovery was due to the Kendali. She was the one who provided the king with the mysterious infusion. Vanus saved everyone's lives as Arian didn't know what to do at the time. The Kendali was a huge enigma to her, and although they shared a room at Arian's own request and conversed fluently, the Kendali maintained a rather reserved attitude about her and her past. She was always dressed in a black robe that completely covered her body and never left her. He only showed that faint whisper with which he spoke and those two big yellow eyes with cat-like pupils that watched everything attentively and penetratingly. For a few days he didn't see much of Gosberg. In fact, he finally realized the importance of the Denka. It was he who was in charge of supervising the king's security. He had the entire palace guard under his orders. Agnorak sometimes stopped by to visit them, but the visits were short and spaced out. Arian was pleasantly surprised, perhaps Gosberg if he was as famous as he claimed to be. As he thought these things, Arian watched from his room the beautiful Bay of Tame and that huge elven bridge, which was now a wall. He thought it was so beautiful that he never tired of looking at it. She had no complaints about her apartments, which were spacious and well lit, nor about the treatment she received, as the king's servants treated her as a member of the royal family. Arian kept thinking about how lucky he had been to end up like this since his hasty escape from Caesarea. "What are you thinking about?" He heard that characteristic whisper that took him out of his thoughts as always. Arian turned around and looked at her interlocutor in surprise. The Kendali stared at her sitting in front of her, wrapped in that robe. "Not at all, Vanus. I was reflecting on everything that has happened to me in these months in my life." The Kendali was silent, staring at her with these strange yellow eyes with the pupils of a cat. Arian lowered his gaze and then looked out the window at the landscape of the bay again. "It's very beautiful what the elves built." Arian commented absently. "Everything elves do is beautiful." "Have you seen elves?" The Kendali got up from her bed to sit down next to Arian's and could see that although Vanus was usually similar in height to Gosberg, she could change her height. She was now much taller. It was possible that the Kendali could modify its size at will. "Yes, I have seen elves, my parents, and I performed for them a long time ago." "Your parents? Do you miss them?" Ever since Gosberg rescued her from the bandits, it was the first time Arian had asked her about them, as she had never dared to ask him anything about it. He thought the memories must still cause the Kendali a great deal of sadness. But now seemed like an ideal time to talk about them. "If I miss them very much, those filthy bandits killed them and forced me to be a slave, until you freed me, so I will never be separated from you." "You don't have to, you have a life to live, you shouldn't depend on anyone." Arian refused to let Vanus be his slave or servant. "I don't have anyone anymore. My parents were expelled from my home and they were the only family I had." They both stared at each other for a moment. The Kendali had suffered too much in her life. She had lost her entire family in the attack of those bandits. Arian had lost her parents, but so young that she could barely remember anything about them. The young woman tenderly hugged the Kendali to give her support. Now that they both had time to reflect on what had happened in the last few weeks, they could try to heal some of their heart wounds. The king was very generous to his two benefactors, showered them with gifts and praise. and even held a banquet in their honor for their great work in resolving His Highness's illness. The two sat next to the king and Gosberg in the most prominent place of the banquet. Agnorok wasn't there as he was on guard, so he watched the celebration from a distance. The food they were served was not very much to the taste of Arian and the Kendali, as the typical dishes of Demember were too spicy and exotic for their taste. As soon as they tasted a morsel, only a little bread and fruit. Gosberg didn't eat much either, but it wasn't really because the food wasn't to his taste, rather it was due to the huge amount of wine he was able to ingest. Arian had never seen anyone drink that way, it was unbelievable. His Majesty, too, seemed to enjoy the feast, eating heartily, and of all the dishes served to him, which were very numerous and varied now that his stomach was fully recovered. The atmosphere of the dinner was very pleasant. Simple music sounded that gave harmony to the atmosphere and made the evening pass in a very relaxed tone. At the end of the supper the king rose to say a few words, and all present were silent. My dear friends, I want to thank you again for your help. If it weren't for you I would still be bedridden. Then there was a succession of cheers and applause from all those present at the banquet, for thanks to them they had saved their necks. Arian and Vanus bowed their heads timidly. The only one who stood up to say hello was Gosberg, though he was unable to keep his balance. The applause lasted so long that Arian had to stand up to say thank you. It was nothing, he said modestly as the Kendali fell silent. His Majesty Dasmir Ilanarban II was a monarch accustomed to luxury, which meant that when he traveled, he was accompanied by a large entourage. Many of his wives and daughters traveled with him in addition to a large number of servants and slaves. Apart from the soldiers who took care of the security of the king and his entourage, but also thanks to his fortune he could hire the services of the best mercenaries in the world. And the company of the Blue Phoenix was his favorite. Dinner came to desserts, where His Highness seemed to enjoy much more. Arian took advantage of that moment to clear up some doubts he had about the reason for the trip to Tame. Even with a good supply of soldiers and mercenaries, for a king to leave the kingdom must have been for a very important reason. Excuse me, Your Majesty, can I ask you a question? Gosberg stopped drinking in his tracks at the young woman's question. The king stood in silence for a moment watching her, and then smiled slightly. Yes, my dear, ask what you want. As I understand it, Demember is a country far from the south, beyond the ocean. So, I may ask you, what are you doing in this faraway kingdom with all your people? His Majesty smiled again at Arian's obvious question and replied affably. My dear, what do we do so much about our home? Well, it's simple. We come to look for something we need and that can be vital for us in the far south. But what have you come to this beautiful city for? Iron, my dear. We need iron. A kingdom in the south prevents us from buying what little iron was for sale by the dwarfs. Iron! Arian exclaimed. Who doesn't need iron in this cruel age? The kingdom of beer has iron to mountains and it's something I need. That is why we are here, waiting for a large shipment that the king has given me to transport to our kingdom. In addition, we both defeated those damned, greedy dwarfs who believe themselves to be the only ones who can exploit the mines. So a war is coming in the south. What Arian knew of the far south were rumors. There were numerous exotic kingdoms continually warring with each other. We don't know, dear. But what we do know is that we will not allow the kingdom of Albiona to blackmail us in exchange for our independence." The king uttered this last sentence with great firmness and determination. Arian, seeing the king's anger, decided that he must abandon this subject, and the dinner resumed in a friendly and relaxed tone. Gosberg told a story of a boat trip and a mysterious island of bird women nesting in trees taller than the Tame Bridge. The king and the other guests at the table of honor listened to the story in amazement, and at the end of the denka the king applauded enthusiastically. When the supper drew to a close, His Majesty turned to Arian and the Kendali. "My ladies, I want to ask you to accompany me on the journey back to my kingdom. I need your help to monitor the state of my health." The two young women were surprised, especially Arian. It was the opportunity he was waiting for, and he did not hesitate. "It will be my pleasure, my lord, to accompany you." "Fantastic! So my trip will be very smooth." Then the king noticed the outfits of the two young women. They were the same as they had since they appeared in the villa, and noticed how the monarch heaved a sigh of disgust. "But your attire is inappropriate for someone who is going to be in my service." The king went to Gosberg, who was finishing with a new bottle of wine. "Gosberg, tomorrow accompany these two ladies to the great market of Tame and see that they buy themselves decent clothes." Gosberg smiled. He could leave the villa again, and it was time. He needed a break. Lately he was so busy that he couldn't make any getaways, and Tame had very interesting taverns to visit. "It will be a pleasure as always to carry out your orders, my great lord." With this order, the monarch ended the dinner and everyone went to rest.